Good morning, everyone. My name is Brad Potter, and I'm a senior analyst at CGSR here at Lawrence Livermore National Lab. And I am absolutely delighted today to have George Moore as our lecturer. Dr. George Moore has been a scientist in residence at the Middlebury Institute for International Studies at Monterey since 2012. And there he teaches a wide range of courses on nuclear topics and drones and surveillance. Earlier in his career, he worked at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in a wide variety of roles, as well as at the IAEA, where he served as a senior analyst in the Office of Nuclear Security. He's also worked as counsel to the Pacific Gas and Electric Company. Dr. Moore is a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis and earned his PhD in nuclear engineering and JD from UC Berkeley. We are just delighted to have him with us here today. Now, before we jump in, I just want to go over a couple of ground rules. His lecture will be recorded, and so we will have the opportunity to post that later on the CGSR website for future reference. However, the Q&A session following his lecture will be off the record. And so that should help spur a lively discussion and help everyone really fully engage. So with that, I want to turn it over to Dr. Moore, and we will hear from him about drones in the modern domestic context, as well as their military, as well as military conflicts. Dr. Moore, over to you.
Okay, Brad, just sound check. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Okay. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. So we're going to be talking today about a number of topics. I've put up here on the first slide my personal email, the Kinmore email, and my Middlebury email. As some of you may know, Middlebury Monterey writ large is closing next year. The place where I reside, the James Martin Center, that's going to stay open. But how it's going to play out and whether we'll get new emails or how that's going to go, I don't know. So if you get a copy, if you request a copy from Brad or from Maria, you'll have both emails. Okay. Drones are in the news every day, many times a day. The new attacks on Iran, Iran attacking other places have, it's 24 hours a day. If you look on the left here, you'll see that there's the infamous attack where the Ukrainians were able to sneak in some trucks loaded with drones and attack a couple of strategic Soviet bases. You see a Bear bomber sitting there. Very spectacular, potentially dangerous. I have no idea whether any of those bases were nuclear equipped or not. Anyway, the only point here, besides the point that the Golden Arches doesn't protect you from being a target, is that, it's an everyday occurrence now. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to hit the high points, and I'm going to leave references in the PowerPoint for you to go back to. I'll mention some of those that I think are more important or more interesting as we go along. So we're going to do a brief history and background. We're going to discuss the types and uses of drones. Excuse me. We're going to discuss killing or targeted assassination with drones. We're going to discuss what's going on Ukraine-Russian Federation. That also changes daily. Post-Ukraine regulations, international and domestic, and privacy issues. Just to give you a few examples, I prepared this slide deck on Sunday. There have been several changes that I would have made in the slide deck if I'd had time. We're now using the Lucas low-cost uncrewed attack system in Iran. There's been several things. Congress has just shot down, that's bad pun, not an intended pun, has just failed to pass the act that would have added additional safety in highly trafficked areas for both drones and manned aircraft. So let's start by discussing what's a drone. We're going to talk mostly about airborne drones. We'll mention a couple of other types, but mostly we're going to talk about airborne drones. But even that is not well understood. There are a number of ways that drones are referred to. Generically, the press says everything's a drone. But when you break it down, Most drones are remotely piloted aircraft. They are being flown remotely, either by a satellite link or even by a closer command link. The Europeans tend to talk in terms of remotely piloted air systems, RPASs, unmanned aircraft, common term, unmanned aerial vehicle, unmanned aerial system. Those all should now probably be changed when you're referring to them as uncrewed aerial systems. Uncrewed is the new gender neutral term that has come into widespread use. But all get muddled up into drones. So is a cruise missile a drone? Well, depends on who you're talking to. And this comes up in issues such as the Missile Technology Control Regime, the MTCR. I like to try and learn something in every presentation I attend. I'm going to tell you something that will stand you in good stead, I hope. Notice this. This is a Reaper. The tails are up. You can see Hellfire missiles under the wings. This is a bigger version of what the older Predator was. Notice the Predator, the tails are down. So if it's tails up, it's a Reaper. If it's tails down, it's a Predator. A Predator is not as heavily armed. In fact, Predator is out of the US military inventory. I actually visited a Predator site a couple of years ago, one of the last ones that was flying. And while I was there, they were flying over the tribal areas in Afghanistan. That is a Bayraktar. This is a Turkish-built drone. The Turks had sold these to the Ukrainians before the Russian invasion. They were used in the beginning of the war, but have now pretty much gone out of use because they're too easy a target. That is a Global Hawk. That is a big, big drone. And it also is one that has truly autonomous capability, although it's not flown that way. By truly autonomous, I mean Global Hawk. If you want to fly it that way, it can start up its engines, taxi out to the runway, take off, fly its mission, come back, land, shut back, taxi back to its revetment, shut down. It's kind of like a Waymo of the air. But this is a big aircraft. It's almost a good fraction of the size of a 737. And it also has extreme range. This is a range over Africa with dwell times. In other words, the little line that goes down, the bottom one being 6 hours, it can go out from Sigonella down around the Sicily, the boot of Italy, and fly down over Africa and persist for 6 hours down near Union of South Africa. So extreme range, extreme capability, and been around for 20 years. This is, again, this is doing it out of Guam. These are not marked, but it gives you some idea of how far these things can range in a normal mission. Of course, they're not going to be ranging over China at this point in time, but they have that capability. This is a typical military control van, which is used to control Reaper, Predator. Predator is still being used by U.S. governmental agencies, DEA, etc. These are a typical mill van. They're built to be interchangeable. Inside, you have two operators. This is the right-hand operator in one of the vans. That's the usual pilot console. They have video. They have throttle. They have the things to control the drone in flight. What's interesting to me is that they do not communicate by voice. They communicate by a secure chat line. And as one of the operators told me, he said, sometimes it's really hard to get these chatty people off the line so you can get actual work done. But the consoles are interchangeable. If they lose one console, they can move the other. The typical sites like the one I was at, they have many of these vans. These can be back in the United States. They can be in forward areas, but the typical thing is to launch and recover drones near, and I'm talking the bigger drones, the Reaper type drones, to launch them near where they're going to operate. And they have a launch and recovery unit which flies the drone off the ground up to altitude and then transfers command to the stateside control station. These are StatCom, Starlink, whatever communication link they have, but there's an inherent delay. And this comes up sometimes when you talk about unintended casualties. With the unit that I was with, the delay was about 4 seconds. So the executive officer of the unit said, look, if I fire a missile and I release it, whatever happens in the next 4 seconds, I can't determine. And he said, on high magnification, I'm looking at the size of a football field. And if I've been tracking a target and I then shoot at the target and along comes a wedding party in a van coming the opposite direction at 60 miles an hour, I'm helpless. I can't call it back. I can't cut it off. That's just going to be incidental damage. Very well integrated systems. There are two groups that operate drones, U.S. drones. The military, of course, the military is doing a lot of that in Iran now. This is a little switchblade drone. It's called a switchblade because it comes popping out of a tube and the wings fold out like a switchblade knife. This is a fire and forget type missile. This is a U.S. Person launching it. Goes out, seeks a target, and hones in on the target. These are just little. The upper left is I think that's my old Phantom, one of my old Phantoms. Lower right, these are little quadcopters. These have been used extensively in the Ukraine war. They haven't been a factor in the Iran war, as far as I know, at this point, because the distances are just too far. But these are close in, fly a couple of miles out. They have forward vision and forward view vision camera. They're used sometimes. The bigger ones can carry actually a weapon and drop it, but more likely they're going to be used to target or send information back to our artillery or other missile systems to engage a target on the other side. Now, pause for a second. Drones are not a new concept. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, that's a drone from 1918. That is a Kettering doodlebug. Not operationally used during the war. Little biplane launched on rails. Had one of the first gyroscopic autopilots made by Sperry Rand. The idea was you fill it up with explosives. It flies out. The autopilot says, oh, we're here, cuts off the motor, and it comes down and explodes. Not very accurate, maybe not too useful. Here's a picture of a rebuilt or reconstructed from plans Kettering doodlebug. This is in the Wright-Patterson Air Force Museum in Ohio. Certainly urge you to go there if you ever get a chance. It's a great museum if you like airplanes and missiles. I show this every year when I teach the course to my students. Some of them, and these are first or second year graduate students, mostly in a range of, mid-20s, early mid-20s. About maybe a third of them recognize the guy on the left as JFK. None of them recognize the guy on the right. Some of you probably do. That is JFK's older brother, the guy who should have been president. That's who old Joe Kennedy wanted to be the family legacy and make president. Why is this in a drone presentation? Well, Joe Kennedy Jr. was killed flying a drone. It was a secret Navy program. Maybe Air Force was involved, Army Air Corps was involved too, to do essentially an upgrade of the Kettering doodlebug using old burned out 4-engine bombers filled with explosives. They were flown towards the target. The pilot, co-pilot bailed out, turned the plane over to the autopilot to go and do the same sort of thing, fly to a location, switch off the engines and crash. Well, about the time Joe was supposed to bail out, the plane exploded. There was not even anything to bring home. So that's why he's in this presentation. That is a Vietnam era, a couple of Vietnam era. These are target drones, but we also use these tactically in North Vietnam to do photo reconnaissance. They actually did film photo reconnaissance. They come out of the Gulf of Tonkin, go down in the water. The Navy would recover them in the film packs. So this is, we've been using drones back since the Second World War, Vietnam, other places. Even older, 1849, the Austrians in the Siege of Vienna used hot air balloons with explosives. And even older than that, think about things that sailing vessels that were loaded with explosives or flammable stuff and sailed into the enemy fleet. Okay, enough of the little history. Let's talk about drone types and uses. Well, you can categorize UAVs in a number of different ways. First, you can categorize the military ones, you can categorize civilian, just break them down. But they're dual use, especially see what's been going on in the Ukraine. They're typically categorized by takeoff weight, sometimes by payload weight, their speed, their range, and their altitude capability. This is the Department of Defense categorization table. This is what's commonly used today to categorize drones into 5 categories. So you'll see across the top, you have maximum takeoff weight, normal operating altitude, speed, in KIAS, that's knots of indicated airspeed, and it has representative types. For example, down in group 5, you have the MQ-9, the Reaper, the RQ-4 Global Hawk, and Triton, which is another big system. So this has become more or less an internationally adopted standard, although nobody's ever really said it is. If you read a number of the writings, you'll find that this is what gets referred to. So why use drones? Well, obviously the first one is safety, save people. You're not putting people at risk. When we're attacking Iran or when the Ukrainians or Russians are attacking each other, they're not putting people at risk, provided that they can't track back to the launch source or the control unit. Another big reason is high endurance. The Predator Reaper operations in remote areas, those aircraft, even though they don't fly very fast, they may cruise at almost a car speed, particularly if they're running into a headwind. They can be up for 24 hours or more. You can't do that with a human pilot. It's very difficult to do. Cost is a questionable issue. Everybody says, oh, drones are much cheaper than manned aircraft. Well, in some instances they are. In some instances, when you do the analysis, you have to account for the fact that drones crash. The launch and recovery team has a very narrow window. They're kind of looking at the runway and the surrounding attitude through a straw. They have a controlled delay, and they don't have the seat of the pants feel for things like a crosswind that a human pilot has. Ability is a big deal. What can drones do that manned aircraft cannot do? All other things being equal, what can they do? Well, some of the things that they can do, for example, in agriculture, if you're going to be spreading pesticides, in an orchard, and it's not something you have to have on the leaves of the trees, you want it near the bases, you can fly under the trees with a drone. Can't do that very well with a helicopter. It doesn't work. So you have to look at each individual operation, figure out what is the most capable. So military and intelligence uses, some of you are involved with this, some of you know this stuff very well. Surveillance, short and long range, attack, various missions and weapons depending upon the capability of the drone. Electronic warfare, not used so much right now. I don't know about what's going on in Iran with drones with electronic warfare, but they have the capability to get into an area and do electronic suppression or detection, picking up and targeting radar systems, etc. A defense against other drones and aircraft, concept of swarming, and of uncrewed combat air vehicles. UCAVs are the designed to go after manned combat aircraft. Or now we have some that are designed to accompany them, to be essentially a wingman. But swarming has a couple of meanings, and sometimes people get confused between this. When I mention swarming here, I'm talking about the drones coordinating with each other while they're in the air. You can also launch a swarm, meaning a large number of drones in an attack, and the Russians have done this repeatedly, but they don't communicate with each other in the air. They're just going for the same target and trying to saturate the defenses. Government uses, a lot of government uses. Counter-smuggling, anti-terrorism, port security, coastal patrol, border, law enforcement. And law enforcement gets a lot of attention because that's when we start bumping in, particularly in the United States, to people and privacy rights, which we're going to talk about later. Emergency response, forest fire, search and rescue, SWAT, fire rescue, etc. Surveillance, traffic, missing persons, a lot of these. But there are conflicts. Old friend of mine, up until a couple of years ago, ran the California Division of Forestry's helicopter firefighting operations. They would not, and I think still will not, fly on a fire if there are uncontrolled drones in the area. If they see them, they'll sit down on the ground. They'll say, either get these under control or we're out of here. There have been some instances, particularly in Southern California, where there's been significant property loss while the firefighting drones sat on the ground. Or, excuse me, not the drones, while the firefighting helicopters sat on the drones because somebody was out there trying to, I'm going to get a video and I'm going to sell it to the news media. A lot of control issues, and we'll start covering some of those in a few minutes. So let's now take a look at the concept of killing with drones. Not a pleasant subject, and comes in a couple of different varieties. Take your pick of presidents going back to Bush and consider how they use drones for the following reasons. Practically used by deployed troops, such things as hand-launched Ravens. When I taught this course earlier not this course, but I taught a course in drone surveillance earlier this month in a weekend-long workshop at Monterey. I had one of the people in it was an Army officer who was an ex-battalion commander. He said, we hated the drones we had. He said they were cheap, they broke all the time, they were just a real pain. We didn't get much out of them. That hopefully is changing and developing better. Intelligence gathering, what's over the hill, what's around the corner without risking somebody's life of finding that out. Targeted killing, and when you do that with US citizens, we've killed thousands of people in these tribal areas, Afghanistan, etc. And no exact count or identification. Quite a number of them are what are called signature killings, where somebody meets the parameters. And infamously, there was one where they killed the guy who was gathering scrap because he was tall and they thought maybe he was Osama bin Laden. This is not very good. And at the end of this program, I'll leave you with something which I won't play. It's an old John Oliver program. And although John Oliver always says his last week tonight is a comedy show, he often discusses very critical news issues in a very well-organized pattern. And he did a program on drones. Like I say, it's 10 years old or more, but it does bring out a lot of the incidents where use of drones, like the use of enhanced interrogation techniques, may be counterproductive. It's also a big issue when you do it with US citizens, which we've done a couple of times. We, being the United States, has done a couple of times because then it brings in all sorts of due process issues. Recent Trump II administration destruction of drug vessels in the Caribbean and Pacific. Most of you know that there are a lot of questions about that. from international law point of view. I don't want to dwell on that. Okay, how do we justify this stuff? And this kind of rolls into one of our justifications for what we're doing in Iran. Does consent make it okay to use drones? That's kind of a more esoteric question, but let's just say there's no consent. Well, we would say we can do this under Article 51 of the UN Charter. And Article 51 of the UN Charter allows for states to react to take out an immediate threat. But if they do that, they're supposed to report to the Security Council, and there's a bunch of hoops they're supposed to follow through. We don't do any of that. So the question is, we do it maybe because we're the 300-pound gorilla, but other people exercising the same prerogative we may not like. Ukraine and post-Ukraine. We're doing fine time-wise. That again is the Bayraktar, kind of a poor man's predator. Again, used early in the war with some success. The Turks provide, this doesn't fire a Hellfire missile, fires a Turkish provided missile. There was originally some question whether the Turks would continue to provide them, which they have, to the Ukrainians. Here's just a little quadcopter with a, this is, I don't know, it's not a fake photo, but that's probably not a real bomb. But you can buy now commercially bomb release or grenade release launchers, or grenade release devices to put on small quadcopters. You just buy them on the internet. I used to task students with giving them a notional $1,000 and see if they could find a $1,000 in a free hand grenade, see if they could come up with a system in a couple of hours, buy off the internet to attack a guard shack from a kilometer away. By and large, they were always successful. That has become way too easy. I mentioned the prior workshop that I did in Monterey. There it was just figure out what you can buy commercially to put together a good attack drone system, and tell me what you have to pay for it. And the numbers range from $5,000, $500 to $5,000. And every student came away with the idea that this is not a difficult task to do. Here we have the typical picture you see out of Ukraine. Other stuff that comes out of Ukraine is AI generated. It's kind of hard sometimes to tell, but this looks like a regular photograph. These are the problems with the Soviet main battle tanks, where they had the ammunition stored up in the turret area. And when they got hit by drones, the turret would pop off, sometimes spectacularly, flying 100 feet, 200 feet in the air. Here again, little switchblade. This is one of our people, 29 Palms, launching a switchblade. This is the infamous Shahed 136. In fact, the Lucas attack drone appears to be a poor man's version, which is kind of funny because it's the United States, creating a poor man's version of the Shahed. You'll see is a little delta wing, small engine, wooden propeller. Nothing wrong with a wooden propeller, been used for years. Originally made by the Iranians, sold to the Russians. The Russians have been making them on their own now. I would say under license, but I'm not sure that they're into the commercial appreciation for the need for a license, but they're making their own. And now there's a jet-powered version of the Shahed. So when you look at the Shahed, and this is when I first looked at this, maximum range of 2,500 kilometers, maximum speed 115. That's max speed, not cruise. Cruise is down more like 95 to 105, depending on altitude, etc. And the warhead weight varies, but it can be a pretty good sized warhead. When I first looked at this, I said, that can't be right. That range just can't be right. And I got the dimensions and figured out how much fuel you could store in the wings if you use the wings for fuel storage, as big fuel tanks. And that range, given the parameters for the engine, is pretty spot on. And of course, you can trade off then fuel weight for warhead weight. And these are launched sometimes in large numbers by the Russians and pose not a very accurate threat against the Ukrainians, but that's improving. They're improving the onboard navigation capability. They're improving the ability for them to detect whether or not they're being drawn off a target by electronic means. This is part of the AI package, which we'll discuss in a couple of minutes. So here's more about the Shahed. 50 horse motor driving a two-bladed propeller. It's kind of a strange way of describing it, but it can be launched out of a TEL truck-like device. There's a picture of a person standing next to one. Again, 40 kilograms. That's a pretty good sized payload. If it hits a target, a soft target, it can do a lot of damage. They don't weigh that much. I mean, a couple people can handle these and move them around. So it's been a very useful thing for the Russian Federation. If you go to this and look at this, I won't play this video. This is a little video of a crashed Shahed in Ukrainian territory with people, walking around it and examining it. You can find a lot of information about the current drones used in Ukraine-Russian war. Popular Mechanics, for some reason, has historically done this. Good article about all the types of drones. This is a reference to that. Talks about all the various drones being used at that time, which is about 2 years ago, and there are a lot since then. You may know that this week, President of Ukraine, Zelensky, offered to many of the Gulf states, if not all of the Arab Gulf states, that he would provide them with counter-drone technology in exchange for things that would aid his war effort against the Russians. Here's just an example of, you can get these big wall charts with different types of drones. These are the Ukrainian drones, and they range anywhere from, old kind of burnout Cessna 150, 172 type aircraft to more modern jet-powered drones. And that was not an idle boost by Zelensky. The Ukrainians have quite a drone industry and are quite capable of exporting drones. This is one of their more recent drones. I'll not try to Polyantisia. It's a long-range missile drone. The photo on the left got truncated because of the way I squeezed it coming out of off an image. They're a lot longer. They're launched on a cart. As they get airspeed and climb away, the cart falls off, and they fly towards their target. The Russians have great difficulty intercepting these. Here's a Neptune missile, again, Ukrainian built, fired from a TEL. And these can go into Russia. When I taught, I keep coming back to this workshop that I taught. One of the women in the workshop was Russian. She was in Moscow and was there with several drones hit Moscow. So, they're flying fairly deep into Russian territory, not just by getting the drones in and launching them from short range, but actually from flying them in from long range outside. Here is a Ukrainian-built seagoing drone. This is the type of drone that sank the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet for the Russians, the Moskva. air defense cruiser. This was a coordinated attack. They used airborne drones to draw the Moscow's attention to that. It came in with these seaborne drones, crashed into the hull, and the vessel was sunk. Didn't go down right away, but it was sunk. So you have, excuse me, you have, if you see here, you've got some a forward FPV type camera that they can use. These almost run like they're almost submerged, so they're a very difficult target to pick up radar-wise. In fact, drones themselves, because of their small size and their small radar cross-section, are extremely difficult for fire control radars and tracking radars to pick up. Okay, let's talk just a bit about who builds drones. And the answer is almost everyone. Build them and sell them. Before the Ukraine war, one of the biggest builders and exporters of military capable drones was Israeli aviation. US does it. We kind of lead the global market. China, very good on cost-effective drones for domestic use and export, although our FCC in January went into effect, put in a ban on Chinese drones, essentially. It's not Chinese drones, it's foreign-built drones. And they grandfathered in all the ones that were here, but this is going to be a problem. The Trump administration is trying to encourage our drone development program. How successful they are in that is going to be questionable, but certainly is putting a crimp in the ability to acquire low-cost, very good operational small drones, because the Chinese are one of the best. Turkey, they're doing well on that. Russia, they're spending a lot on UAVs to modernize their military. The United States is spending a ton now in modifying, in researching, building drones for all sorts of purposes. We have seagoing vessels now. We have even drones that launch as tankers off aircraft carriers. In the past, fighter would be dedicated with a large fuel tank and stream what in my day we called a buddy pack, and they could refuel other limited refueling. Now they can do that with a drone. India, France, Australia, South Korea, Germany, all of these people are building this stuff. And this leads to a real problem, because one of the things about regulation, and we'll talk about regulation down the road here, the cat's out of the bag on most of this stuff. There's maybe some areas where we can still do some regulation, but not very many. So here's of interest, particularly with what's going on today. These are some overlays of ranges of different Iranian systems out of Iran. And depending on what's left of their missile and drone inventory, you can see that ships in the Mediterranean, ships all the way down into the Red Sea, or actually over into the, I guess it'd be the Bay of Bengal there still, but into the Indian Ocean, are at risk from Iranian things, drones and cruise missiles. The Houthis in Yemen, they even have their own domestically built drones. They claim to be manufacturing them. They've shown some support. I don't think this is Photoshop, but they displayed a couple of years ago their drones that they were producing. Whether they were producing all of these or some of these were given to them by the Iranians is not totally clear. So now let's talk a bit about counter-drone technology. We've seen that drones are increasing their capabilities, and we haven't even discussed how AI may enhance the existing capabilities. AI is already used to a limited extent, but it will also expand on things that we now look at. Counter-drone technologies, stages of counter-drone engagement. First of all is detection. And that can be a real problem. First of all, can you defend all your high-value targets? We've got roughly 100 nuclear power plants in the United States. If we were worried about defending those against drones, could we put in 100 or 200 detection systems? How would they be manned? Would they be run by AI? Would they be run by people? Once something's detected, it needs to be evaluated. You saw the tragic friendly fire shoot down of 3 of our aircraft by the Kuwaitis. The evaluation somehow went wrong. Then you've got to engage it somehow using drones, missiles, and aircraft artillery. I'll come back to Eagles in a minute. Some kind of electronic warfare, for example. You can shut down GPS in the area to disrupt their navigation, or you can do spoofing, providing them an incorrect GPS signal so that they don't know where they are or they're led astray. Eagles, the Dutch have actually developed eagles that will engage small drones. They look at it as a game. They can throw a net over it. They can grab them with their claws. They get a treat, and they're actually pretty damn good at doing it. So before you even begin to look at counter drone engagement, you have to look at how to protect targets. You've seen in the Ukraine war how both sides started building cages for the tops of their tanks to protect, to make the weapons go off further away from the armor so that the armor piercing, usually shape charge technology, doesn't work as well. Netting, generation of new bunkering with overhead protection for airports or for airfields. How you saw the attack on the Russian strategic fields. Those aircraft were bunkered, they were in revetments, but there was no cover over the top. I don't know, but I bet if you go back now, a lot of those have had nets put over them. We've used netting in the past as a counter helicopter assault protection. Increased target hardening. There may be an active armor analog. Active armor, if you look at the sides of an Abrams battle tank, you'll see explosives that are actually there kind of facing outward. And if the explosive gets hit by an incoming missile, the explosive on the tank goes off and it degrades the incoming system so that hopefully it's degraded enough that it can't kill the tank. So counter drone engagement and protecting targets, we're going to have to do a lot more thinking about protecting targets, both military targets, civilian infrastructure targets, et cetera, all of which is going to be expensive. Now, here's a new issue, relatively new, that many people haven't been looking at. This is the issue of advanced air mobility vehicles and eVTOL issues. eVTOL is electronic vertical takeoff and landing. So what are these things? Well, you can think about them as crewed or uncrewed air taxis. You can think about Blade Runner. Remember in Blade Runner, Harrison Ford gets into a vehicle and flies around downtown LA, which looks like a dismal prospect. But also you have to think about them as heavily loaded suicide or remotely piloted attack vehicles. And think about the security implications of that. Right now, terrorists would have difficulty getting something like a big UAV to make an attack with, to carry a big load of explosives. But if you've got an air taxi that's uncrewed and can carry 4 people, let's say the average person is even 150 pounds. So what is that? That's 600 pounds of people that can be replaced by a 600-pound warhead. And we know that there are some people who are even suicidal. But there are 2 types, basically, of these vehicles. This is a Joby design. This is an airborne taxi system. Joby is actually a company down on the Monterey Peninsula. They've gotten certification. They actually did a flight from their facility to the Monterey County Airport, I think in January. But they're very credible. And we're not the only ones. There had been a promise for the last Olympics in Paris that a French company was going to set up an advanced air mobility taxi service. They failed to get final approval. It would have been a point-to-point service going from some places like the airport to someplace close to the venue. And then there's the Jetson-like fly yourself to work vehicle. And the FAA has no idea, well, I shouldn't say no idea. They're working on how to control these vehicles and integrate them into the airspace. And they haven't reached any firm conclusions about that. In fact, in the United States, almost all the domestic regulation is still very, very conjectural and changes moment to moment. Okay, let's talk a little bit about post-Ukraine. What's going to happen when eventually, as eventually it must, the Russia-Ukraine war stops? Where do we go from Ukraine? Well, every military is running as fast as they can to prepare for the types of things that they're seeing in Ukraine and what they anticipate from Ukraine. One of the lessons historically is we always prepare to fight the last war. Not clear how that is going to work here. Effects of AI. AI is going to have, it already has some effects. It's going to have more effects. And we'll talk about that in just a second. The AI changes. What is AI going to do that will change the use of drones, the defense against drones, etc.? It's bound to assist both attackers and defenders. And we can think about that in 2 ways. One is what I'll call onboard, meaning on the attacking drone or on a defending drone, something that's carried on the drone itself, versus offboard, which means somehow AI is assisting in developing attack profiles. AI is assisting in defending against the drones, evaluating, doing all this stuff, so change detection, evaluation, etc. So, onboard AI can or will assist attacking drones in real-time optimization of in-flight attack profiles, feeding it routine updates from external sources to the onboard AI. The onboard AI will have its own integrated stuff, which will then maybe be able to detect whether it's being spoofed, maybe detect, we lost GPS, or there was a little glitch in GPS, maybe that's a true loss, maybe that's something that somebody did. It will assist the attacking drones in looking at what they can sense through AI about their path to the target or about the target itself. Offboard AI can assist the attackers in mission planning, providing situational updates to the drone in flight, etc., etc. And these will become more and more powerful. Similarly, AI on and offboard can assist defender drones in bringing down attacking drones. It can, for example, integrate detection of launch and warning. and track evaluation and target estimation and things that could be transmitted to the defender drones to assist them in acquiring the target, can assist in turning on defensive systems and allowing defenders to engage more successfully. AI can assist swarming, both offense and defense. Remember, we talked about the uncrewed combat air vehicles. We may see very, very sophisticated swarms that can make at least even medium altitude manned aircraft, render them useless in the battle area. One of the characteristics before the Ukraine war, of course, there'd been the use of these high-flying drones by the U.S., targeted assassination, etc. But I think everyone pretty much assumed that, hey, these won't be able to do much in an area where there is an active air system of defense. And people at the start of the war said, hey, the Russians will be able to knock down these drones. And in fact, they, as we mentioned, they had some success against the Bayraktars. But the Russian fighters can't get down for the low stuff because of shoulder-fired missiles. This was a fact that was kind of not really anticipated so much. And now the low airspace is pretty much not free to drones, but it's pretty difficult for manned intervention in those aircraft. The area that's receiving a lot of attention right now is AI automated defense systems. This is, everybody's questioning whether this is lethal AI, whether we need man in the loop, person in the loop, etc. Note that we've had such systems for quite a long time. We had missile intercept systems, which if they lost their primary target would acquire a secondary target, etc. And the current fire and forget AI systems do exactly that. Summary, AI will make drones more lethal, both attacking and defending. AI will not have significant impact on some drone issues like range. Maybe a minor impact, but motors, airframes, etc., those are not going to be affected by AI. AI incorporation will be an ongoing issue. You saw what happened just last week with Anthropic. None of these things are for sure. Okay, briefly, let's spend a minute on liability issues. There are all sorts of things that may go wrong with drones. And at least domestically, when we're talking about civilian drones, we have to think about that. A big thing is constitutional rights and privacy, which we're going to talk about. But there's a whole list of things. Air-to-air collisions is the thing that the FAA worries about. Regulatory issues. Regulation is a work in progress in many, if not most states. And by that, I mean states internationally, not states domestically. Although it's true for states domestically in the United States. We're still up in the air on who can regulate drone use, destroy drones. These are largely undecided from the legislature and also from the judicial branch, with sporadic guidance from the executive branch on these issues. International regulation of drones, this is done by the ICAO, which so far has really not done much other than provide guidance to the member states about how they might do their own internal regulations, and also does some advice via advisory circulars. If you want to read about that, you can use this reference here. There are no treaties about drones. There are no international treaties about drones. There are attempts to control the spread of military drones by export control systems. And there are efforts to control proliferation of dangerous drone technologies via the Missile Technology Control Regime and the Wassenaar arrangement. I don't want to deep dive into those, but those are both out there. Domestic control is just all over the place. Sometimes it's done by various agencies depending on the country. Sometimes it's by the aviation group. Sometimes it's by the commerce, their equivalent of the Commerce Department. And there are some states, for example, in Germany, which have delegated down from the top levels to individual political entities. Excuse me, let me cancel that. Have brought it down to what we would call here in the United States state level. The big thing everybody's worried about is how do drones see and avoid collisions? All our airspace regulations depend on drones depend on vehicles in the air seeing and avoiding other vehicles. Even if you're on a commercial flight going into San Francisco or Burbank or JFK, the pilot, even though they're on an instrument flight rules plan, is bound to see and avoid, which is not easy in commercial cockpits, other aircraft. So the drone industry is trying to get that changed to sense and avoid. And they made some inroads in that, but it's still way up in the air. What's typically regulated is how high drones can fly, flying proximity to buildings and people, registration, communication, weight. Can drones be flown out of view? Can an operator fly multiple drones? Can they operate at night? Who can protect against drones and destroy them? A good overview of drone laws by country is this 2025 Global Guide, which you can refer to later. In the US, the major thing about who can control, the FAA guards this dangerously, judiciously. The FAA is in control. They want to be in control. Okay, I'm getting Brad looking at me kind of like, when are you going to get done here? Let's jump ahead. I want to cover one other thing. You can go back and pick some of this other stuff later, but I want to play a very short video for you. Just think about all the things who can destroy a drone. Right now, there's a new January 26th Safer Skies Act, which sounds wonderful, except it only is for major events, and it only involves trained law enforcement people who have to go through FBI training. It's not every county sheriff can shoot down a drone type law. Privacy issues. How do you feel about privacy? Well, different people feel differently about it. This is actually a link to a woman who was at a beach. She was in her bathing suit at a beach. A teenager flew a drone over it. She tracked it back to the operator. They got into an altercation. She was actually arrested. There's a whole series of Fourth Amendment cases. This is illegal search and surveillance. Let me mention just briefly Suriolo, which brings up these are almost all Northern California drug cases, with a few exceptions. Suriolo was a guy who was a reputed drug dealer in the San Jose area. And the police knew they didn't have enough to get a search warrant. They knew what was required to go to a judge to get a search warrant. So they said, hey, let's get Joe DEA specialist. We'll put him in an airplane. And Suriolo's built this big fence, which we can't see over, but we can fly over his property and look down and see what's in his backyard. So they did that. And Joe, drug guy, filed an affidavit with the court and said, hey, I'm a drug expert. I looked down into his backyard from this plane flying at 1,000 feet in the air. And sure enough, I saw drugs. Under current law at California, that probably wouldn't be an offense, but I saw growing of marijuana in his backyard. Judge issued a search warrant. They were absolutely right. Mr. Suriolo went to jail. He appealed, saying that they needed a warrant to do that. Went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. You know, everybody says, well, so I'm an attorney and a member of the Supreme Court bar. I have some background to say this. And everybody says, I'm going to take that all the way to the Supreme Court. Well, yeah, if you're lucky and you're 1 in 10,000, that might happen. But the Supreme Court doesn't take very much. And in this case, they said, anybody flying at that altitude could have looked down and could have seen what was there. They totally ignored the fact that this was targeted. They weren't just flying along. It would have been one thing if the police had been flying along and, on their traffic patrol and looked down and said, hey, wait a minute, I see some marijuana in this yard. Not done. So a long series of cases developed where it's okay if you're flying an aerial vehicle in an airspace where that's allowed. Well, that means in the United States, if they're flying right outside your window, they don't need a search warrant. And that's kind of dangerous. And there's going to be a development in this. The preemption case, if the federal government has set out laws in the area, like, who can, where you can fly drones, et cetera, other entities, states, counties, cities can't preempt that. They're preempted from making a regulation in that area. That's percolating up through the courts now, but not done. Mega privacy threats. Here, we'll spend a few minutes. Argus and Gorgon stare. If we were live in class, I would say how many people have know about this. I find that a lot. We're not going to worry about satellites, but think satellites as well. Back in the days of looking for Saddam Hussein, the government said, hey, we can read the shoulder patches on the guards to tell what units they're from. So, it's not, nobody's really had a case so far where they said, you needed a search warrant to use satellite images of my property to find me for building I didn't get a permit to build my swimming pool in Livermore, but that may happen. Again, tails up, that's a Reaper. What are those pods? Well, we don't know exactly. But here's the idea of wide area airborne surveillance, or WAS. The idea is to monitor a whole area and to get real-time feedback, store the data, requires massive storage. This is Gorgon Stare, about a 4-kilometer radius. You can do this for essentially a city. There was a proposal to do this. This has been around for 15 years. This is the one video I want to show. Oops. So we'll watch this hopefully for a minute or two, or probably about 4 minutes, and then we'll be ready pretty much to go to questions.